Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I'm Venkat. This is part 49 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll learn about common table expressions. Before continuing with this session, I strongly recommend to watch part 48 of this video series. Common table expressions are introduced in SQL Server 2005. So what is a CTE? A CTE is a temporary result set that can be referenced within a select, insert, update or delete statement that immediately follows the CTE. Let's understand what we mean by this definition with an example. So here you can find the syntax for creating a CTE. So to create a CTE, we use the with keyword. For example, to create a stored procedure, we use create procedure command. Similarly, to create a table, we use create table command. But to create a CTE, we use the with keyword. So with keyword followed by the name of the CTE and then the columns that would make up your CTE. So what is a CTE? A CTE is a temporary result set. So obviously a result set will have columns. So what are the columns that would make up your result set? That is what you specify here within a pair of parentheses. Then you use the as keyword, then another set of parentheses, and then your CTE query there. Let's look at this with an example. We have two tables here, TBL employee and TBL department tables. TBL employee has got ID, name, gender and department ID columns, and TBL department has got department ID and department name columns. Now let's say I want you to write a query which gives me an output that you can see here. I want the total number of employees by department. Obviously, to achieve this output, I don't have to use a CTA. I can simply achieve this by using joins and group by. But since we are talking about CTEs here, let's see how to achieve this using a CTE. So I'm creating a CTE here called employee count. I'm using the with keyword, with employee count. So employee count is the name of the CTE, and department ID and total employees are the columns that form the CTE. As, and then this is your query. So if you look at this query, it's pretty straightforward. What is this query doing? It's selecting two columns, department ID and total employees. Okay, count of star as total employees from TBL employee group by department ID. So this query will return me the total number of employees by department ID. But if you look in the output, I want total number of employees by department name. Okay, so this select query is nothing but your CTE query, and if you look at the select query, it's returning these two columns, and these two columns will map to these two columns that you can see here. This CTE has got department ID and total employees. Your select query has got department ID and total employees. So these columns map to this CTE columns. Okay, and then look at the way we are using the CTE. This CTE is now being used in this select query. So you're joining the employee count CTE with TBL department table. And why are we doing that? Because the employee count CTE has got department ID and total employees. Department table has got department ID and department name. So we join the employee count with TBL department on the department ID column. And we retrieve department name from TBL department and total employees from employee count CTE, and finally we order by total employees. So if you execute this entire query, we get the output that you see here. Let's look at the CTE in action. So we are creating this CTE with employee count. These are the columns that would make this CTE as, and this is the CTE query, the select query that would actually serve the data for the CTE. So now when I actually execute this select query alone, look at this. I get this. This is nothing but a temporary result set, a result set. And for this result set, you are giving a name called employee count. And this column, department ID and total employees returned by your select query, is mapping up to the columns in this CTE. Okay, and then what you're doing, you're joining this employee count with TBL department table, and the rest of the stuff is pretty much a simple join here. And finally you're ordering by total employees. So if we execute this entire stuff, we should get the output that we are expecting. Alright, Now, the columns that you specify for the CTE here are actually optional. If you don't specify, I mean, look at this. Obviously, when you execute this query, you get these two columns. Now, if you don't specify the column names for your CTE here, what is going to happen? The same column names are retained and then used as the columns for this CTE. So let's execute this and we get the same amount output still. Okay, so it is also possible that you can just say, okay, instead of saying department ID, I can just say DEP ID, and instead of saying total employees, I can say total. But then the moment you do that, the columns, though this query is returning them as department ID and total employees, for the CTE, they will be mapped to DEP ID and total employees will be mapped to total. So when you refer to that CTE in the select statement, you will have to change those column names accordingly. Okay, because if I try to execute this now, we get an error. Invalid column name, department ID, because on employee count CTE, I don't find a column called department ID, because you have renamed that to be DEP ID. So you should use DEP ID. And similarly here, you have to specify that as total. So now when we execute this, we should succeed and get the same output. Alright, if you don't specify, if you do specify the columns, the number of columns that you specify here should match with the number of the columns that your select query is returning. If you say, for example, let's say I have another column XYZ, for example. Okay, look at this. Your select query is actually returning two columns, department ID and total employees. Department ID will be mapped to DEP ID, total employees will be mapped to total. But there is no third column in the select query to map to XYZ. So obviously when I try to execute this, it throws an error stating that employee count has fewer columns than were specified in the column list. Obviously that makes sense. Okay, so the number of columns that you specify here should match the number of the columns returned by the CTE query. Alright, now this is important to keep in mind. If you look at the definition of the CTE, a CTE is a temporary result set. We know what we mean by that. And then a CTE is a temporary result set that can be referenced within a select, insert, update or delete statement that immediately follows the CTE. So if you look at the way we are using the CTE, we are using the CTE within the select statement. If you look at the select statement, it follows the CTE. There is nothing in between the CTE and the select statement. That's why we are able to use that. But on the other hand, it's the same CTE except that I have select hello here. Okay, we are using another select statement, and within the select statement I am not referring to the CTE, but then there is another select statement here where I am referring to the CTE. So obviously what's going to happen, by the time we execute, this query gets executed, the CTE is gone, because this CTE will be available to a select, insert, update or delete that immediately follows the CTE. If you try to use it anywhere else, then if you try to do something else in between, we get an error. Let's look at this in action. So here we have the employee count CTE, it's the same thing, and then we have the select hello in between. Now look at this. If I comment that, and then if I try to execute this entire thing, we succeed. We get the output that we were getting before. But on the other hand, look at this. The moment I uncomment this, we are not using the CTE in the select, insert, update or delete statement that immediately follows the CTE. So obviously you cannot access this employee count in this select statement, because this is not the immediate select statement for this CTE. So let's see what happens if I try to execute this. We get an error stating common table expression defined but not used. Okay, so that's why in the definition it's very clear, a CTE is a temporary result set that can be referenced from within a select, insert, update, or delete statement that immediately follows the CTE. And I hope that makes sense now. Alright, it's also possible to create multiple CTEs using a single with clause. Now we know that to create a CTA we use the with clause. So you specify with keyword and then the name of the CTA and then the columns that would make up that CTE as your CTE query. So this entire thing is one CTE. But if you want an additional CTE using the same with keyword, what you can basically do is put a comma, another name of the CTE, another CTE, and then the columns that would make up that CTE as select query that can that makes up this CTE. So it's possible to create more than one CTE using the with keyword just by separating them with commas. So what we are doing here, it's pretty simple. Now if you look at this select query, all we are doing is we are getting the total the total number of employees by department, but we're filtering, we are only doing it for IT and payroll, and here we are doing it for HR and admin departments. So obviously when I execute this query, you should see we get the total number of employees for IT and payroll departments, and when we execute this query you should see that we get the total number of employees for admin and HR department, and we have named our CTEs accordingly. So this gives us employee count by HR and admin department. This gives us the employee count by payroll and IT department. And the way we are using that, there is a select statement. Look at this. Now you might be wondering, okay, I am using this CTE within this select statement. This is another select statement where I am using maybe this CTE. So I'm not using them within a select statement that immediately follows CTE. Actually, this entire thing is treated as one statement because you're using the union keyword. And we have spoken about union keyword in the previous sessions of this video series, which basically unions the result of this query with this query. So this entire thing is treated as one statement. So obviously now if I execute this entire thing, you should see total employees by department for all the 4 departments. Okay, so this example illustrates that it's possible to create multiple CTEs using a single with clause. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.